And today I want to talk to you more about songwriting. And I want to talk about the songwriting rules. And as I've heard different people saying, I think it was Jason Bloom, who's a songwriter and a lecturer on songwriting. There's not really rules as much as they are tools. Now, I've learned this from different perspectives. I studied classical music in college, song structure, things like that, as well as songwriting classes from people who wrote songs for Britney Spears and things like that. And it's really about communicating. So I'll read my article, and I'm sure I'll throw in a lot of things extemporaneously as well. So rules can be broken, but you need to know the rules before you break them. Because you could break them to get some kind of effect. You do it for a reason. You need to know the parts of a song structure and the purposes of each. The chorus, the verse, the bridge, a solo, a development section, an outro, an intro. Take several favorite songs and listen only for the structure. Just listen to the structure, and you'll start to see certain patterns. Now, rules, I'll use that loosely, such as ways to structure rhythms, melodies, song structure, using tension and resolution. They serve to give a foundation to ground the song. If something is too, the human ear, the human psyche, whatever you want to call it, has evolved to respond to novelty. If something is slightly different, we pay attention to it. At the same time, if something is very repetitive, we feel comfortable with it, but at the same time, after a while, it just becomes background, and we stop paying attention to it. That's just the way the human brain works. If something's novel, we pay attention to it, but at the same time, if it starts going if something's relatively random, that also becomes noise, because it's just random. That's noise. That's like white noise. You might as well be listening to at the same time. Again, if something is repetitive, it gets really boring. Happy birthday to you. It's not very interesting. So the key to keeping people's interesting, drawing them in and be able to communicate with them, is balancing there. So the rules kind of help those aspects of that. Transitioning from a verse to a chorus creates and their verse should be different than your chorus on a few different levels, rhythmically, melodically, and the reason is it gives it novelty. At the same time, you have a certain amount of consistency. These things are help the human brain be able to absorb these things. So they actually make sense. They're not just doing it because that's the way it's always been done. We gravitated to certain ways of writing songs or story structure. When you have a story and it develops and you have different ebbs and flows in the story structure, whether it's Shakespeare or Star Wars, that's a reason for that, and it works. But some of the most interesting things are when you do break those rules. So you could break the rules and balance and ground that, to have that right balance between, let's say, random, or novelty versus comfort, so to speak. You balance it and ground it by using others. So you have all these, not rules, but tools. And you know what each one does. So if you go off in one area, you use maybe the other tools to balance it, so that you maintain a certain balance. At the same time, is making it interesting, because you're going off the beat path, so to speak. Now, if you break all the rules, you don't follow any songwriting structure rules or melodic rules or concepts, it becomes anarchy. It becomes noise. And there's writers, avant-garde writers that that have done things like that. They try to break almost every rule. There's no structure, and even then there's some, if you listen to Schoenberg's Serialism, they had patterns where they tried to not repeat any melodic patterns whatsoever. But even then, that's a pattern in and of itself, and that's not something you really would ever want to listen to driving down the highway. Burial is another one where it just is very novel, very interesting and weird, but at the same time, Varese, Cage, all these avant-garde guys, they play a part in music because they influence a lot of people to showing how far you could go as far as making things weird and novel. And then other people kind of maybe use those things, like Zappa might use concepts that Varese, if I'm pronouncing it properly. And there's nothing wrong with that. Some people want to be more avant-garde, but don't expect to be popular. At the same time, if you can use those novel concepts and be interesting and different and break the rules, but know what that you're doing and know why, you could make some magic. If you break all the rules, it becomes anarchy. If you break none of them, then it's just predictable and formulaic, boring. So as far as hooks, people say, I don't want to use hooks, that's so commercial. Well, we sing you a couple of hooks. People want to say, be artists. Bum, 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 ba-da-da, ba-da-ba, ba-ba-da, ba-da-ba. Okay, that's a hook. That's Mozart. Mozart was into hooks. Bum, 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 bum. Beethoven, that's a hook. Okay, whether it's Michael Jackson, Beethoven, Ozzy, a hook just means a melodic idea that's repeated so that people could gravitate to it. There's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't even mean commercial. What does commercial mean? All commercial really means is people want to hear it. Now, granted, there's a lot of commercial crap out there that's bubblegum, and maybe it's just marketed, so well that people heard it so many times they kind of start liking it because they didn't have, as many choices out there. That's a whole nother video. But a hook is something that the ear can grab onto that moves a song from one place to another, that helps tell the story. It's not just notes in the key or runs up and down scales. Even jazz improv, which goes all over the place, starts with a melodic motive, then develops from there. You might listen to John Coltrane, and you might start with a standard melody, dun dun da dun dun, ba dum bum ba dum bum, and then he'll go off into some 12-tone crazy stuff on an acid trip, and it's but it'll come back, and that's what makes it interesting. If you just went into the solo just right from this note one, people wouldn't, there's no home to kind of go on the trip and come back to. So all music and life are cycles that progress between various states of tension and resolution. Science, nature, breathing, music is just an expression of that already existing principle of life and the universe. If you play Mozart for an animal, it'll calm them down if it's a calming Mozart song. If you play Stravinsky or Bartok, they'll probably become a little rambunctious or uneasy, whether it's an animal or even a baby. So it's not just a society thing. It's just the way the brain works. They did studies where they went to tribes where they had never, the tribes had never been in touch with outside civilization, and they played them music of different types, stuff that was in minor keys that was considered sad by us, and happy major keys. And when they heard it, they pointed to the smiley face on the happy songs and the sad face on the sad songs. So it's not like even a cultural thing. They understood that the minor Beethoven song was a sad song, or the happy march song was a happy song. These are universal things. They're discoveries more than invention, so to speak. So keep this in mind and use that to express the story of the lyric, as well as use it to simply progress the flow from one part to the next, one note to the next, one beat to the next, one progression cycle to the next. For example, like a 5-to-1 progression. The principles, there's a mathematical reason why 5-to-1 progression works, and that's maybe a whole nother video because there's a tritone resolution there. But that helps. It just makes it feel like there's a tension on that 5 chord with a tritone, and then it resolves with a smooth movement. And I'm not going to go, if you want to understand that better, go to music school or watch another video. But that tension in there that's inherent helps progress the feeling of the song and the movement of the song. So you need to know this stuff. Basically, you want to draw the listener in, but change before they get bored, but not be so erratic that you lose them. It's not a complicated concept. You need some balance. How you balance that is a big part of how that you make art out of it, how you make it your own. One example that I like to use when we talk about breaking the rules and then balancing things out is Stravinsky. That's just a good example in classical music. What Stravinsky did was he broke a lot of rules. If you listen to The Rite of Spring as one famous example, he's using polytonal, polyrhythm. He throws away a lot of structural things that you heard in Beethoven or Mozart, things that came before, 100 years before. In the early 1920s, he came out with I don't know the exact year, I forget what it is, Rite of Spring, and it broke a lot of rules. But he also knew the traditional compositions were quite long. You have multiple movements. If you look at the symphonies that Beethoven did were in 4 parts, and it could be 15 minutes long each. It can be 45 minutes or hour long for one piece of music. And he was breaking so many rules that he knew that he couldn't have an hour piece like that. The Rite of Spring is around 15 minutes or so, that piece. So he balanced that out. There's a lot of novelty there, and then he kind of balanced it by making it a little shorter. One example, he did a lot of pieces where he melodically broke a lot of rules. He wasn't sticking to, here's a major scale. He was doing polytonal things, 12-tone things. And so melodically, these things were wacky for the time. But what he did is he went back a couple of 100 years to very strict rhythmic structures from Bach. Now, if you don't know too much about classical music, I know I'm oversimplifying, but Bach's rhythmic structures were very straightforward. Whereas, let's say Mozart would use ties and dotted notes and things like that. It was after Bach. Ties, rests, and things like that. Whereas Baroque music, which is Bach, was more very, very, very rhythmic patterns. And then Mozart started playing with that more. And then, of course, as you get later and later, you get all sorts of rhythmic changes. So if he had a song that had 12-tone things that wasn't just a major scale or minor scale, 5-to-1 progressions, he would make sure it was very strict and held very strictly to rhythmic patterns. So some people had a rhythm to be grounded with. Same thing if you listen to the Latin music. There's a lot in the piano playing a lot of times. You'll hear a lot of chords that are just wacky, dissonant chords. It almost sounds like they're just banging on the keyboard, but it sounds amazing. A lot of that has to do because it's so rhythmic. It's just solidly rhythm. So something is very solid and very reliable, and another thing is all over the place, and that balances it. So the further you go, in general, the further off you go in one direction on something, you kind of almost need something to pull it in the other direction, so that way you could kind of get close to the edge, go off, go as far as the edge as you possibly can. If you know here's the ironic part, if you know your rules really well, in songwriting and the formulas and all the rules of songwriting, you have this capability of being able to go off the deep end and still make it work. And that's really artistic. So when I talk to people that don't want to be artists, they don't want to bother reading a book on songwriting structure or things like that because they want to be true artists. They're missing the point. And what happens is they wind up doing stuff that nobody wants to listen to, and they think it's because they don't get their art. And it's like, no, it's like you're just a crappy songwriter, or you just understand what you're doing, and you're just randomly doing things that you think because it's weird or because it's different that it's great art, and it's not necessarily so. I'd have to think long and hard to think of someone that made some amazing art, whether it's Stravinsky or John Coltrane, that didn't have an understanding of this concept, didn't know all the rules of songwriting, rules or tools or whatever, and know about these things, and then use them and wield them. Because once you know them, you could break all the rules that you want. I remember there was at William Patterson, one of the teachers, they had a jazz department that was renowned, and one of the jazz teachers, someone that was famous, I forget which one it was, but he had it right on his door. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, before you can conceptualize a form, a certain genre, you have to master it. And I'm paraphrasing, but basically what he was saying is what I was just saying, is that you really have to understand the basics and understand all this formulaic stuff before you just start experimenting and doing some artsy version of it. If you skip that step, then it's just going to be throwing spaghetti at the wall, thinking you're an artist, and it's just weird. And there's a very, I don't want to say a thin line, but it's a very definite line between art that's, maybe weird and experimental, but art, something that'll last, something that's actually saying something fresh and different in an interesting way, and stuff that's just weird. And sometimes it's a matter, there's even arguments about artists, but Stravinsky was art. There's no doubt about it. John Coltrane, art, no doubt about it. A lot of, you have a lot of artsy people, degree in music, but that's just a starting point. So bottom line is it's got to draw people in. When people first heard Rite of Spring, they had a visceral reaction. Some people hated it, but they had an emotional reaction to it, which means that the music was doing something that affected the people in an emotional way. It made them feel uneasy. Listening to the Rite of Spring makes people feel uncomfortable, uneasy. But how powerful is that? When just sound waves could change someone's emotion. That's like a movie that makes you cry. How hard is that to do? To make something where they just stare at a screen, and you make them think and feel about things about life to the point it makes them cry and connect with these characters who they've never heard of before. Same thing with the song. Same thing. If you could do that with just a melody, rhythm, that's art. So think about that.